The galaxy voted. Humans are the most deadly life form ever recorded. The silence after Yuna's speech lasted longer than anyone expected. Not just in the room, in the minutes after she stepped back from the podium, but in the days and cycles that followed. The conclave did not respond immediately. No formal statement came from the classification committee. No revised vote was called. The delegates returned to their sections and their regular business, and the Grand Assembly went quiet. And Yuna went back to the small, plain human conference room and sat with Junho and waited. 3 days passed. On the 4th day, a message arrived from Doran of the Velhari Collective, requesting a private meeting with the human senior delegation. Dasik brought Yuna with him. Doran was already seated when they arrived, in a small room off the main corridor, with 2 of his senior staff flanking him in their careful Velhari way. He was quiet for a long moment after they sat down, which was normal for him. Everything Doran did was slow and deliberate, like a very large piece of machinery that ran without hurry because it was built to last. He said that the speech had been heard. He said that the Velhari Collective had spent considerable time since the vote discussing the question of what the classification meant in practical terms, whether it called for restrictions, monitoring, revised territorial agreements. He said that before the speech, the consensus among his senior staff had leaned cautiously toward a formal recommendation of increased oversight of human activities in border territories. He said that after the speech, the consensus had shifted. Not because the data had changed, not because the history had changed, but because the argument Yuna had made was one that none of the analysts had thought to model for, that the awareness of dangerous capacity could itself function as a restraint, that a species which had looked at its own potential for destruction and chosen, imperfectly but genuinely, to move away from it, might be something other than a threat. He said the Velhari position was now that the classification should stand, because the data supported it, but that the conclave's response to the classification should be reconsidered. Dasik asked what reconsidered meant, in practical terms. Doran said it meant that instead of oversight, the conclave was considering invitation. The word landed quietly, in the small room. Yuna did not react visibly, neither did Dasik, but something shifted in the air between them. Invitation meant something specific in conclave language. It meant that instead of being managed, a species was being brought closer to the center of things, trusted with more, given more, asked to contribute more. It was the opposite direction from restriction. It was the kind of offer that took centuries to arrive for most civilizations. Humanity had been in the conclave for 31 years. The next 3 galactic cycles moved quickly by conclave standards. Doran's shift proved to be the leading edge of a broader change in the room. One by one, in formal sessions and private meetings and small corridor conversations, delegations began to revise their positions. The Marin Collective submitted a formal statement supporting expanded human involvement in border mediation. The Asa delegations, who had been silent since the vote, sent a brief and careful message to the human section, saying only that the speech had been noted and that they wished to meet. The Krath Military Council, whose observer report had described human soldiers as indifferent to the logic of survival, submitted an official request for a joint training exchange program. The request from the Krath, of all delegations, made Junho laugh in the same surprised, genuine way he had laughed reading the file. Yuna felt it differently. She felt the weight of it, the seriousness, the responsibility, the fact that what was happening was real and would have real consequences for real people across a very large amount of space. 6 months later, the Conclave's Committee on Interstellar Conflict formally proposed a new role, the position of Human Mediation Advisor, to be assigned to active conflict zones where negotiations had stalled. The proposal was clear about the reasoning. It said that human mediators would be effective not because they were neutral. They were not. They were members of the conclave like any other species, but because every party to any conflict would know what they were dealing with. A species that had chosen restraint, repeatedly, voluntarily, with the capacity not to. That history was itself a kind of credibility. It said, without a word being spoken, we know what destruction costs. We have paid it. We are choosing something else. You can trust that choice because it was not easy. The proposal passed. Not unanimously. Several delegations abstained, and 2 voted against it, raising legitimate concerns about precedent and the complexity of assigning moral weight to historical choices. The concerns were recorded and noted. The proposal passed anyway. Yuna was appointed as the first human mediation advisor at the age of 30. Taeho attended the ceremony in the conclave's formal hall. He had not been invited specifically. It was an open session, and he had decided to come on his own. He sat in the upper gallery, in the same seat he had occupied during the speech, and watched the ceremony below. The hall was full again, though differently full than it had been on the day of the vote. The tension was gone. What remained was something harder to name, a kind of collective paying of attention, the way a room feels when the people in it understand they are watching something that will matter later. Yuna stood at the center of the hall to receive the appointment. She was dressed the same way she always dressed, plain, dark, professional. She did not look like someone who had changed anything. She looked like a person doing her job, which was, Taeho had come to believe, probably the point. Dasik presented the formal commission. She received it quietly. The ceremony did not require one. But before she stepped back, she paused at the podium for a moment, not to speak, just to look out at the room. The same room where she had sat in the back corner 6 months ago, not fully paying attention, half reading a document, while a vote was taken that would change what humanity meant in the galaxy. She looked at the Velhari section. She looked at the Marin section. She looked at the shimmering Asa delegates, and the quiet, careful Krath observers, sitting in their usual place at the edge of the floor. She looked at the hundreds of other delegations, species she had learned to recognize, and some she was still learning, filling the curving rows of the enormous hall. She thought about Rena, who was still working, still running into damaged structures on whatever moon needed her, still answering the question of why she kept going back, with the same simple answer. She thought about Kangsu, who was somewhere in the outer territories right now, measuring soil samples on a planet no one had named yet, doing work that would take 30 years to show results, doing it anyway. She thought about the people on Earth who got up every morning and taught children, treated patients, grew food, built things, repaired things, stayed. The millions of ordinary people who had no idea they were part of the reason a room full of alien delegates had slowly, over 6 months, changed their minds about what humanity was. She stepped back from the podium. Up in the gallery, Taeho sat with his hands folded in his lap and watched her walk back to her seat. He had spent 42 years studying war, its causes, its patterns, its costs. He had read the files of 600 civilizations and believed he understood the shape of things. He knew now that he had understood most of it, just not the most important part. The most important part was not in any file. It was the part where a species looked at what it was capable of and decided, every single day, to be something more than that. He would need to write a new section in the methodology. He was not sure yet how to measure it, how to model it, how to fit it into the careful language of conclave research. He had time. Below him, the ceremony concluded. The hall began slowly to empty. Delegates moving back into the corridors of the conclave building, and to their various offices and meetings, and the ongoing, endless, ordinary work of keeping a galaxy from tearing itself apart. Yuna left through the side door, Junho at her shoulder, already talking about the first assignment. The galaxy had voted, and now it was waiting to see what humanity would do with the trust. The galaxy voted. Humans are the most deadly life form ever recorded. Ambassador Dasik had been doing this job for 26 years, and he had learned a long time ago to recognize the particular kind of certainty that was not arrogance. When Yuna came to him the morning after reading the file, she was calm. She was not performing calm. He had seen that enough times to know the difference. She was genuinely settled inside herself in a way that told him she had thought through what she was about to ask, and she was asking it not because she wanted the attention, but because she believed it was the right thing to do. She sat across from him, hands folded on the table, and told him she wanted to address the full conclave. She told him what she wanted to say. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he would make the arrangements. It took one cycle to set up. The conclave's scheduling office had, apparently, been expecting the request, or something like it. The human delegation had been formally notified of the classification, and formally invited to respond. And the conclave had reserved session time for exactly this purpose. What they had not expected was that the response would come from a junior diplomat, rather than the senior ambassador. But Dasik had submitted the request in proper form, and the conclave had no rule against it. They approved the session without comment. On the morning of the address, Yuna stood outside the entrance to the Grand Assembly and breathed slowly. Junho stood beside her. He had printed out a copy of her notes the night before, and gone through them with her line by line, asking questions, pushing back on the parts that seemed too easy or too clean. She had revised twice. The final version she had memorized, but she had left the notes behind in the conference room on purpose. She did not want to read from a page. She wanted to speak. "You don't have to be perfect," Junho said. "I know," she replied. "Just be honest." She nodded. The doors opened. The Grand Assembly was fuller than it had been on the day of the vote. Word had spread, the way it always does when something unprecedented happens, and delegations that did not normally attend general sessions had sent representatives to watch. The air had the same tense, waiting quality she had felt before, but layered now with something else. Curiosity, maybe, or the specific kind of attention a room gives to something it doesn't know how to predict. Yuna walked to the central platform. She was not especially tall, not especially striking in appearance. She wore the standard diplomatic attire, plain, dark, professional. She stood at the podium and looked out at the thousands of faces, forms, and presences arranged in the great curving rows of the hall. The Velhari section, the Marin section, the tall, shimmering delegates from the Asa worlds. Most of them she did not. She let the silence sit for a moment. Then she began. She said that she had read the full evidence file. She said that she was not going to stand at the podium and argue with the data, because the data was accurate. Every historical fact in that document was real. Every number was correct. Humanity had done the things the file described. She did not deny any of it, and she was not going to. She said she understood why the vote had gone the way it did. She said that if she had been sitting where they were sitting, reading what they had read about a species she had never met, she might have voted the same way. The room was absolutely still. Then she said she wanted to tell them about a woman named Rena. Rena had been a field medic stationed on a small colony moon in the outer belt during a period of industrial conflict between two competing mining operations. The conflict had involved armed personnel. There had been structural damage, atmospheric breaches, and casualties on both sides. It had been, by any definition, a dangerous and active combat environment. Rena had run into damaged structures 14 times during that conflict. Not 14 times total in her career. 14 times During that single conflict, which lasted 11 weeks, she had pulled out 31 people. Some of them were from the side she was technically assigned to support. Some of them were not. She had made no distinction. She had looked at a person who needed help and provided it, regardless of which side of the conflict they came from, regardless of the risk, regardless of the fact that the structures she was entering were structurally compromised and continued to deteriorate with each passing hour. When someone asked her why she kept going back, she had said that somebody had to. Yuna paused. She said she also wanted to tell them about a man named Kangsu. Kangsu had spent 30 years working on environmental restoration projects on planets where human industrial operations had caused damage. He was an engineer, not a politician, not a public figure. Most of his career was spent on worlds where there was no human population, just damaged ecosystems, contaminated soil, disrupted atmospheric chemistry. He worked in teams, with careful methodology, measuring and adjusting over years and decades. He would not live to see the full results of most of his projects. The timelines were too long. He knew that when he started. He went anyway. She said that the Conclave's file had measured humanity's capacity for destruction with great care and accuracy. It had measured their resilience, their persistence, their refusal to accept limitation. All of that was real. But she said the file had missed something. She said that Rina and Kangsu were not exceptional humans. They were not rare cases pulled from history to make a point. They were ordinary people doing what a very large number of ordinary humans did. Not because they were required to, not because someone was watching, but because they looked at something broken and could not stop themselves from trying to fix it. She said that yes, her species had nearly destroyed itself, several times. She was not proud of that. But she said that every time they had come close to the edge, the thing that pulled them back was not law, not enforcement, not fear of punishment. It was other humans. People who noticed, who could not look away, who stayed. She said the same capacity that made humans persistent in conflict made them persistent in care. That the same stubbornness that drove a soldier to refuse retreat drove a medic to run back into a burning building. It was the same trait, turned in a different direction. She looked out at the room. She said she was not standing there to ask the Conclave to ignore what the data showed. She was standing there to ask them to look at the complete picture. Because the most dangerous thing about humans was not that they could destroy. It was that they knew they could, and most of them spent most of their lives actively choosing not to. She stepped back from the podium. The Grand Assembly did not applaud. Applause was a human convention, and most species present did not share it. What happened instead was something Tejo, watching from the researchers' gallery above the main floor, had never seen in 42 years of attending conclave sessions. The room did not react. It simply held. No murmuring, no movement, no ripple of color across Valhari's skin, or vibration from the Marin section, or light pulses from the Asa delegates. Just a complete, total, present silence, the kind that does not mean emptiness, but means that something has landed, and everyone in the room is still feeling the weight of where it fell. Tejo sat very still in his seat in the gallery. He had compiled the evidence file. He had spent weeks with that data. He realized now, sitting in that silence, that he had understood the numbers and missed the point. He looked down at the small figure standing at the center of the enormous hall. He thought, that was the part that was not in the file. The human delegation's conference room was small and plain compared to the rest of the conclave building. Most delegations decorated their spaces, filled them with items from their home worlds, cultural objects, lighting conditions tuned to match their native environments. The Valhari section smelled faintly of cool mineral water and was lit in pale blue. The Marin section was always warm and dim and hummed with low vibrations. But the human section looked more or less like a regular office. A long table, plain chairs, a wall screen, water dispensers, and stacks of printed documents that the human staff preferred over digital readers, for reasons no other species had ever fully understood. Yuna sat at the table with the full printed copy of the evidence file in front of her. She had been reading for 2 hours. Across the table, her colleague Junho sat with his own copy, turning pages slowly, occasionally pausing to go back and reread something. Junho was 34, 3 years her senior, tall and quiet, with a habit of chewing the end of his stylus when he was thinking hard. He was chewing it now. Neither of them had said much since the documents arrived. The senior ambassador, a man named Dasik, had reviewed the file earlier that morning and then left to make calls. He had not told them what he thought of it. He had just left, which was more than enough information on its own. Yuna reached the section on the near-extinction events and read it twice. She knew the history. Every human knew it, in the general way that people knew their own species' past. Aware of the large shapes of it, without having thought deeply about what those shapes actually looked like from the outside. She had learned about the Ice Age population collapse in school. She had learned about the Cold War. She had learned about the climate crisis of the early 21st century. She had learned these things as history, as things that had happened and been resolved and left behind. Reading them now, in this file, compiled by researchers from 12 alien civilizations and formatted as threat assessment data, was a different experience entirely. It was strange to see your own story told in someone else's language. She turned to the biological assessment section and read the line about humans being, by standard metrics, biologically fragile. She read the line about the sleep period during which humans were essentially defenseless. She read the observation about humanity's refusal to acknowledge physical limitation as a permanent barrier. And she stopped there and looked at the ceiling for a moment. She had never thought of herself as particularly dangerous. She had never been in a physical fight in her life. She spent most of her time reading documents and sitting in meetings. She liked tea and old books and long walks. She was, by any ordinary measure, a completely unremarkable person. And yet here was a document written by people who were not human, who had spent 18 months studying her species from the outside, concluding that her kind was the single most dangerous form of life ever catalogued in the known galaxy. She thought about that. Junho turned another page. He stopped. He read something. Then, slowly, a sound came out of him that Yuna had not expected. He laughed. It was not a small or polite laugh. It was a real one, surprised and genuine, the kind that comes out before you can decide whether it's appropriate. He caught himself after a moment and pressed his hand over his mouth, but his eyes were still creased with it. "What?" He turned his copy around and pointed to a paragraph near the bottom of the behavioral analysis section. She leaned forward and read it. It was a quote from a Velhari strategic analyst, written in the flat, careful language of official conclave reports. It described human beings as uniquely capable of sustaining destructive action over extended periods without psychological collapse, while simultaneously maintaining complex social bonds, aesthetic sensibilities, and a documented preference for peaceful resolution in non-conflict contexts. Underneath that, in the summary notes someone had written, "This combination of traits has no parallel in the galactic record. The species is, in the committee's assessment, an existential anomaly." Junho pointed at the words existential anomaly and raised his eyebrows at her. It was the kind of thing that hit you in 2 ways at once, the weight of it and the absurdity of it arriving at exactly the same moment. She did not laugh, but she felt the pull of it. "They're actually scared of us," Junho said. His voice was quiet, not triumphant, just processing. "Yes," Yuna said. Of us, specifically. Not our weapons, not our military. Us. The document is pretty clear about that. Junho set down his stylus and leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. We almost killed ourselves 4 separate times, he said. That's what scared them most. Not that we're strong, that we survived being this destructive. Yuna did not answer immediately. She looked back at the document and then at the blank wall across from her. She thought about what the next few cycles would bring. The formal response, the address to the conclave, the process of navigating something that had no established precedent. No species had ever been rated this way before. Not unanimously, not with this kind of supporting evidence. There were no guidelines for how to respond. No senior diplomat could tell her what the right tone was, because nobody had ever been in this position. She thought about Rena, a medic she had met during her early posting on a colony moon near the outer belt. Rena had been small and serious, and had spent 6 years running into damaged structures after mine collapses and atmospheric failures, pulling people out with her hands when the machinery couldn't reach. She did not talk about it much. She just did it. And when someone asked her why she kept going back, she had said very simply that somebody had to. She thought about Kangsu, an engineer she had worked with briefly on a terraforming assessment project. He had dedicated his career to repairing environmental damage on planets that human industrial operations had harmed. He worked slowly and methodically, and cared enormously about getting it right, even when the planets in question were uninhabited and no one was watching. She thought about the people she had grown up with, her parents, her neighbors, the teachers who stayed after hours, the strangers who helped when something went wrong. Ordinary people, all of them. Capable of ugliness, yes. She knew that. History made that clear. But also capable of something the document in front of her had apparently failed to fully measure. She closed the file. She looked at Junho. I want to address the conclave directly, she said. He looked at her. You're not senior enough for that. I know. I'm going to ask Dasik to let me anyway. Junho was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the way he did when he thought something was probably right, even if he wasn't sure yet. What are you going to say? Yuna picked up her pen and pulled a blank sheet of paper toward her. I don't know yet, she said, but I'll figure it out. The galaxy voted. Humans are the most deadly life form ever recorded. Teiho had spent 42 years studying war, not fighting it, studying it. He was a researcher, a senior analyst at the Conclave's Department of Interstellar Security. And in 4 decades of work, he had reviewed the conflict histories of over 600 civilizations. He had read battle records so old, the original language had no living speakers. He had studied the collapse of the Marin Empire, which had wiped out 3 star systems in a single century. He had reviewed the biological warfare campaigns of the Drath Collective, which had sterilized 14 planets before being stopped. He had seen, in data and in records, what living things were capable of when they decided to destroy each other. He thought he had seen everything. He had been wrong. It was the morning after the vote when his supervisor called him into her office and dropped a sealed file on the desk in front of him. The file was thick, not physically, it was a digital package, but it felt thick in the way important things do. It had been compiled over the previous 18 months by a team of 37 analysts from 12 different civilizations. It had been reviewed twice before reaching them. His supervisor told him his job was to take this file, read every word of it, and prepare a formal presentation for the human delegation in 3 cycles' time. She told him to take his time reading it. He understood why about 4 hours in. The file on humanity was not like any other species file he had ever read. Most species files followed a predictable shape. There was a period of early development, usually tribal and violent, followed by a gradual consolidation of power, followed by either expansion or collapse, followed by either stabilization or extinction. The pattern repeated across hundreds of species with only minor variations. It was almost boring how similar the paths were. Humanity's file did not follow the pattern. Humanity had nearly gone extinct at least 3 separate times in its recorded history, not counting the periods before written records. The first time was a climate event that had reduced the entire human population to a few thousand individuals in a single region of their home continent. Tejo had seen similar events in other species' files. Usually, that was the end. A species reduced to a few thousand rarely recovered. The gene pool was too small, the environment too damaged, the civilization too broken. Humans had recovered. They had not just recovered, they had expanded. They had spread across their entire planet within a few thousand years of that near extinction, which in evolutionary terms was essentially instantaneous. The second near extinction they had caused themselves. Tejo sat with that detail for a long time. He read the supporting data 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Humans had developed weapons of sufficient destructive power to end all complex life on their planet. They had built thousands of these weapons. They had pointed them at each other for decades. They had come, according to the Conclave's analysts, within minutes of using them on at least 4 separate occasions that were clearly documented, and possibly more that were not. And then they had stopped. Not because they ran out of weapons, not because one side destroyed the other. They had looked at what they were doing, looked at what they were capable of, and a significant portion of them had simply decided not to do it. They had negotiated, slowly, imperfectly, with enormous difficulty and many failures. They had pulled back from the edge they had built for themselves. Tejo found this deeply unsettling. He was not sure why at first. Then he realized it was because no other species in the database had ever done that. Other species had been stopped by force, or by exhaustion, or by extinction. Humans had stopped themselves. That required a specific kind of self-awareness that the Conclave's behavioral models simply had not predicted for a species at that stage of development. The third near extinction was environmental, a slow, accelerating damage to their planet's systems caused by their own industrial growth. Again they had caught it. Not quickly enough to prevent significant harm, but quickly enough to survive and begin repairing the damage. Again. Real. But the biological data was what truly separated humanity from anything else in the file. Tejo called up the physical assessment section and read it slowly. Humans were, by any reasonable biological standard, fragile. They had no armor, no natural weapons of significance. They were slow compared to most apex predators on their own planet. They required specific temperature ranges, specific atmospheric compositions, specific nutritional inputs. They were vulnerable to an enormous range of diseases and environmental hazards. They slept for roughly 1/3 of every day, a period during which they were almost completely defenseless. By every standard metric, they should have been prey. They should have been near the bottom of their planet's food chain, or perhaps the middle, something to be hunted. Instead, they had hunted everything else to the edge of extinction, through tools, through cooperation, through an almost irrational persistence that the analysts described, in dry research language, as a refusal to acknowledge physical limitation as a permanent barrier. Humans had encountered obstacles, cold climates, deep oceans, high altitudes, the vacuum of space itself, and had simply built things to overcome them. They did not evolve to survive in those environments. They built their way in. The interstellar conflict data was the final section, and it was the shortest, because humanity had not yet been involved in many interstellar conflicts. 31 years of Conclave membership was not a long time, but in those 31 years, on 3 separate occasions, human personnel had been involved in small-scale conflicts in border territories. The outcomes of all 3 had been noted in detail. In each case, the human forces had been significantly outnumbered. In each case, the opposing force had expected a quick resolution. In each case, the humans had not retreated, had not surrendered, and had not behaved in any way that matched the opposing force's predictions. One report from a Krath military observer, who had witnessed one of the three engagements from a neutral position, described human soldiers as indifferent to the logic of survival, in a way that reads less like courage and more like a fundamental absence of the instinct to quit. The galaxy voted. Humans are the most deadly life form ever recorded. The hall was so large that sound itself got lost inside it. It had no ceiling that any human eye could clearly see. The walls curved upward and disappeared into a pale gray mist that hung far above the floor, like a permanent cloud. Thousands of seats filled the space in wide circular rows, each one built differently, some tall and narrow, some wide and flat, some shaped like bowls of liquid where creatures floated instead of sat. Every seat was taken. Every delegate from every known civilization in the galaxy had come to the Galactic Conclave's Grand Assembly, and the air was thick with the sound of 1,000 different languages being whispered at once. It was the largest gathering in over 200 years. Yuna sat in the far back corner of the human delegation section. She was not a senior diplomat. She was 29 years old, recently promoted, and had only been assigned to the conclave 6 months ago. Her job, most days, was to review documents, prepare briefing notes, and sit quietly during sessions she had not yet earned the rank to speak in. She had a small desk, a glass of cold water, and a datapad in her hand that she was only half reading. She was watching the room instead. She had grown up on Earth, reading about the Galactic Conclave the way other children read about ancient kingdoms. Something enormous and distant and almost impossible to believe was real. And now she was inside it. She still was not fully used to it. The creatures around her were so different from anything she had grown up seeing that some days she simply sat and stared. There were delegates with 4 arms and pale translucent skin. There were beings that looked like tall columns of dark smoke, held together by some invisible force. There were small, quiet creatures with enormous black eyes, who communicated entirely through light pulses that flickered across their skin like quiet lightning. None of them paid her much attention. Humans were still relatively new to the conclave. They had only been full members for 31 years. In galactic terms, that was nothing. That was less than a blink. At the front of the chamber, standing on the wide central platform, was Ambassador Doran of the Velhari Collective. The Velhari were among the oldest civilizations in the conclave, calm, precise, deeply respected. Doran was tall, blue-gray in color, with a flat face and wide silver eyes that never seemed to blink. He moved slowly and spoke slowly, the way very old and very confident beings tend to do. He had been speaking for nearly an hour. The subject of the session was the Lifeform Threat Classification Review, a process the conclave carried out once every 100 years. Every century, all known data on every known species was collected, reviewed, and ranked according to a set of carefully developed threat metrics. The metrics measured things like biological capability, destructive history, adaptability, population resilience, and what the conclave called conflict initiation rate. The review existed not to insult or accuse any species, but to help the conclave make informed decisions about diplomacy, territory disputes, and interstellar security. It was, most of the time, a dull process. The rankings rarely changed much. The same few species tended to appear near the top: apex predators, hive mind civilizations, ancient warring empires that had been fighting someone or something for thousands of years. This cycle was different. Yuna noticed it before she understood it. She noticed it in the room itself, in the way the murmuring slowly died down as Doran reached a particular section of his presentation. In the way, delegates who had been resting or talking quietly to their assistants began to sit up straighter. In the way, a low ripple of something moved through the crowd. Not a sound exactly, but a kind of tension that changed the feeling of the air. She sat up too, without knowing why. Doran had reached the final category, the top of the ranking. He stood on the platform and spoke in the conclave's universal language. His voice carried evenly through the hall by the translation systems built into every delegate's seat. He said that after reviewing all submitted data from all member civilizations, the classification committee had reached a conclusion. He said the conclusion had been reviewed 3 times because the first 2 reviews had produced results the committee found difficult to accept. He said that following the 3rd full review, the result had been confirmed. He spoke the name of the species. The silence that followed was total. Yuna looked up from her datapad. She had heard the word, the universal language word the conclave used for her species. She had heard it clearly. She looked around the room, trying to read the faces, or whatever passed for faces, of the thousands of delegates around her. What she saw was not anger. It was not hostility. It was something quieter and stranger than either of those things. It looked like fear. Across the chamber, a senior Valhari delegate leaned toward his assistant and said something in a low voice. The assistant's skin changed color slightly, a pale, involuntary shift that Yuna had learned meant stress in Valhari biology. 2 rows ahead of her, a delegate from the Marin Collective, a species that communicated through sound vibrations in their chest, was producing a very low, very steady hum that their cultural briefings had described as a fear response. Nobody was looking at Yuna, but somehow she felt like everyone was. She put her datapad down on the desk. Doran continued speaking. He said that the vote on the official classification had been conducted privately among the committee's senior members, and that the result had been unanimous. He said this was only the 4th unanimous result in the history of the review, in over 2,000 years of records. He said the conclave would now open a formal period of discussion on the implications of the classification, and that the human delegation would be formally notified and invited to respond within the next 3 cycles. He stepped back from the platform. The room did not erupt. There was no shouting, no dramatic reaction. What happened instead was a slow, spreading stillness, like a stone dropped in deep water, the ripple moving out in all directions, quiet and wide. Yuna sat very still in her chair. She did not fully understand everything that had just happened. She understood the words. She understood that her species had just been ranked first on the Galactic Conclave's official list of the most dangerous life forms ever recorded in the known galaxy. She understood that the vote had been unanimous, which had happened only 3 other times before, and that 2 of those previous times had resulted in containment protocols. She picked up her glass of water. Her hand was completely steady. She took a slow sip and looked out at the enormous room full of alien beings who had just, collectively, decided that humans were the most dangerous thing any of them had ever encountered. She thought about that for a long moment. Then she reached for her datapad and began writing a message to the senior delegation office. It was calm, professional, and brief. It said, "We need to talk.